Good afternoon, everybody from Chandigarh. I'm sorry I've not been able to be in there. Looking back 50 years, one was also, I had a great opportunity to fight in the Battle of Basantar as part of three Grenadiers. The most intense all arms battle fought by the Indian Army till date. Good old memories. Today, we are on a subject looking into the future. What are the future conflicts likely, and how do we actually prevent them? Part of deterrence, whole concept. I am now joined by two extremely experienced people, Ambassador Shokoji, who is one of the most renowned diplomats. He and I have been working together on the UN-related matters for many years now. He's a great writer and one of the most seasoned diplomats that you can come across. He's also incidentally got a Fauji background. His wife is a daughter of a Lieutenant General, so that makes him half Fauji. And that's Dhruv Katoch, who's again an infantry officer like me. Got exceptional operational service, third generation officer in the Dobro Regiment, and is now thereafter was heading Claws, and thereafter was also now heading India. What is that, Dhruv? Just correct me.
Foundation.
India
India
Foundation.
Foundation.
Sorry, I'm being part of the outside the Delhi circle, so you'll pardon me. Okay, I'll just try and give an overview into what the present strategic environment is. I'll not take more than 2-3 minutes, and then throw it over to the panelists. The last 2 years admittedly have changed the whole landscape of the complete globe. How we look at conflict, what conflict really is. And the sad part is a pandemic, a tragedy of such magnitude, rather than uniting this world, has made us more divisive. There are more conflicts, more hate, more violence, more distress, more this thing. And this is totally the opposite. And why did it happen? It suddenly happened as the world started getting multipolar. A lot of countries and a lot of regions thought they can make it go alone. And when they tried to go alone, the virus crossed all boundaries and there was a collapse of the systems, complete collapse of international systems, regional systems, and I'm sure the panelists will cover about it. Now, the emerging trend, the way we look at conflict has changed. It's no more the conventional part. It is not even nuclear. There are a whole lot of other areas that have come in, including cyber, non-state actors, and that I will leave it to both the panelists to do. I will come down to the regional strategic context. How does it impact us, the future? The India-Pakistan-China triangle remains at the heart of South Asian conflict. That's it. You have to keep managing this triangle how you do, but that's a reality. It's been there for a long time. It's becoming even more pronounced. The second part is that the US influence has got diminished. And along with that, China and Russia have now started emerging as a powers. And as India, as a regional power, tries to balance its relationships, its alliances, we have to see what is the shift in the power centers, both at the global level and at the regional level. Of course, we have a huge variety of border concerns, which is border disputes, proxy wars, scenes lines of communication, terrorism, internal strife, whole lot of them which the panelists would like to do. But the main point is our resources are totally outstretched as of now. Can this be allowed to go when you look at future conflict? Are we able to capable of handling such conflicts of such intensity? So there are three themes that I thought this part will cover. All three themes are interlinked and they will be covered by the speakers as a package because you cannot look at exclusivity in one area or the other. The theme one is, what are the trends and likelihoods of the future conflicts that we want to see in South Asia, both in intensity and spectrum? And that covers a very wide spectrum, not only from cyberspace to a whole lot of things. Theme two is, how are the regional geopolitics developing? How do we manage mistrust, which has become at the heart of South Asian countries? How do we get into a non-linear assessment so that we stay ahead of the story arc and are not driven? Presently, strategy is driven by tactical. Every time a case happens, we start building up and moving towards that. Who is looking at this conflict, the future conflicts, in a holistic manner to stay ahead of the story arc? And finally is, in spite of all this, South Asia continues to be mired in the lowest human indices and huge economic distress. How do we get regional convergence on things like which are common to us: climate instability, human security, and economy? So I will give both the panelists 10 to 15 minutes each, and they can cover it in the way you want. As I said, idea is not to cookie cut a whole lot of things and have hiccups in between. Just take it through 10 to 15 minutes, Ambassador Mukerji, and then followed by Dhruv. So over to you, Ashok. And the moment Ashok finishes, Dhruv, you can take over.
Well, thank you. Thank you, General. I hope you can hear me. How we look at conflicts that are likely to emerge in the future in our part of the world, I think will continue to be rooted in the triggers of conflict that have taken place in the past 50 to 70 years. And the triggers of these conflicts have not really gone away. And in terms of our region, I think one of the major triggers of conflict is territorial claims. If in 1948 the Jammu and Kashmir issue arose because of territorial violation of our territorial integrity, in the May 2020, the same territorial issues provoked the conflict in Galwan. So this is something that needs to be addressed. There have been attempts in these past decades to put in place a structure, a mechanism to address territorial differences, divergences, to prevent, as the phrase goes, disputes from becoming disagreements from becoming disputes. But I think that we are likely to see an intensification of this trigger. And therefore, that is something that we need to keep an awareness of. And as you put it, it is more and more becoming a convergence of two sides, Pakistan, China, vis-a-vis India. I think that is something that we need to be aware of. The second trigger, which has been there for the same number of decades, is linked to resources. Many years ago, in 1960, we found a way to address the trans-boundary water resources of India-Pakistan through the Indus Water Treaty. But today, as many of us are aware, there are similar issues with regard to China and the sharing of water resources between India and China. Can we look at a mechanism to address this issue or not? I think that is going to be one of the big questions which will be linked with the emergence of conflicts in our part of the world. Now, the third trigger of conflict, as I see it, has been below the surface, but it is linked with what you mentioned, which is the bread and butter issues of South Asia. These are conflicts which are triggered by the demand for resources, for economic growth, for coming together. And, in South Asia, the big tragedy so far has been that we are perhaps the only region in the world that doesn't have a regional integration in place. You look at every other region of the world, they have made some progress in regional integration and therefore created a confidence-building measure of dialogue to address differences. But in our part of the world, despite the attempts made from the mid-1980s onwards, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation has really not gone anywhere. And it is true that in the past few years, we have seen a sub-regional grouping in our region called BIMSTEC take root. But BIMSTEC is not a substitute for SAARC. And I think that it's important to recognize this, because one of the issues that you and I, General Leader, have talked of is the return of the Afghanistan problem. We've had a discussion of whether this issue is a part of South Asia or not. And I think that from 2007 onwards, when Afghanistan became a member of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, Afghanistan and what happens in Afghanistan is part of the South Asian landscape. And I think that this is something that we need to recognize, because we cannot keep our eye off the ball in Afghanistan and expect that we will be able to resolve issues which crop up in the India-Pakistan China triangle in the coming years. Because whatever happens in Afghanistan and whichever way that issue is handled in Afghanistan will have an impact on the way conflicts are managed in South Asia. And I think that the fourth point that I'd like to make, and this is something that is appropriate to mention today when we are remembering 1971, is the presence in our region of linguistic nationalism. We recognize the emergence of Bangladesh. In the morning, the panel discussion was very interesting to listen to, that as opposed to religious nationalism, which the British used to create the partition of India, there has been the presence of linguistic nationalism, of which Bangladesh is the best example. That it is the Bengali language that gives a character to this phenomenon. But now we must look, as we look to the future, at the role of linguistic nationalisms as triggers of conflict. And I think that, again, taking the case of Afghanistan, we've talked about it. There is the issue of Pashtun nationalism, of Pashto-speaking people. People have, in this conference, mentioned Baloch nationalism, Balochi linguistic nationalism, Sindhi nationalism. And in the context of Afghanistan, Tajik nationalism, which is 27% of the population of that country is Tajik. So, we have to understand it, speak of it, and then see how to deal with it. So these are the four big triggers that I see that we need to be aware of. And to turn to what you asked about how to deal with this, how to manage these triggers, I think the tried and tested way, and that has been so since 1920, is the way of international cooperation. It can be bilateral, it can be regional, it can be beyond regional. But without international cooperation, without cooperation between countries and within the region, we will find it difficult. We cannot go it alone. I think I would agree with what you said. No one country can go it alone. And in the case of India, I think the best example of what I'm trying to say is in our entire Indo-Pacific or maritime ever since we announced our Indian Ocean policy of Sagar in March 2015, we have been looking at the role of providing security in the maritime domain. And I think every year we see the heads of our armed forces establishments talk in public about how we are still not able as one country to provide the comprehensive security entire Indian Ocean maritime domain. We need partnerships. And therefore, I think that this is something that is important. And linked with that, and that's the other comment I'd like to make before General Katoch comes in, is the need to realize today peace and security are multidimensional. I think that's very important because there has been an empowerment of the world, and especially in our region. People have become empowered, and so therefore there are more stakeholders. In the panel just before ours, there was this question of perception and how perceptions are created and so on. Now, we have to find a way to bring in the stakeholders, whether they are the perception creators or whether they are the people who benefit from peace and prosperity, the corporates, or whether they are people who want to have a better, the next generation, the youth, civil society. We'll have to bring them into this discussion of how to address future conflicts in South Asia. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I think General Katoch, perhaps you would take on from here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Asoke. Just one or two points before I get on to Dhruv. This is very interesting points to make about linguistic nationalism. While being in Africa, I realized that the ethnicity and tribes. Are you speaking, Asoke?
Yeah, I can listen to you.
Okay,
I'm not
okay.
speaking.
Whenever you go around in Africa, people tend to relate more by ethnics and tribes rather than their own nations. That's a very interesting phenomenon. As we look at the populations and look at the ethnic thing, as the world changes by climate or other triggers, one will have to see how this demographic dividend really works. That was one point. A second point, I'll come back after Dhruv finishes, is climate security. Somehow we back home are just not talking about it. And all over the world, people feel that the biggest trigger of conflict, and it suddenly will throw up such massive displacements, massive conflicts is going to be there. But we'll come back to that moment we finish. Dhruv, over to you, please.
I'll just be careful of the time so I don't exceed. General Leader has already warned me about that particular aspect. Right. The way I look at it, and I'll take off from where Ambassador Asoke Mukerji left off. The start point, I will say, is what happened in August this year in Afghanistan and the way the Americans withdrew. And while America still is the sole superpower as of now, and China is still many miles away, but I think what this has really proved is America no longer can carry out unilateral action. And this point, I think, was referred to earlier by the chair. Unilateral action now will have is, I think, passé. It won't take place. But if America wishes to change anything as far as any hotspot in the world, any interference, if they wish to do it, they will have to go with other countries along. They will have to take them along. For the Americans to act unilaterally, the way they did in Iraq, I think it's out. I don't think it's going to happen anymore. So that is the first trend which has taken place, and I think it's a very important. It's a very important change in the geopolitics of the world. Now I look at the fault lines, and they will directly impact India whether we get involved or not. But I will look at fault lines from 5 different angles. The first is the ideological angle. Now, these ideological fault lines directly impact India. And the first ideological, when we look at the India-Pakistan divide, I'm not too convinced that it is a territorial issue. I'm not convinced at all it is a Kashmir issue. It is an ideological issue because at the birth of Pakistan, Pakistan became what India was not. So if India has to go left, Pakistan will go right. And if we go forward, they will go backwards. They will do everything which is opposite to what India does. And one of their former presidents, who's, I think, Musharraf Saab, who I think is currently, perhaps I think is located in the UK, I'm not sure. But when he was asked, he was no longer the president then, he was taking refuge in the UK. And when he was asked, is Kashmir the issue? And he says, no. Because even if Kashmir is given to Pakistan, the rivalry will not end. And I think this is one point which we need to understand. We keep talking about Kashmir. Kashmir has never been the issue. The issue has been ideological, and that ideological issue stems back many, many years prior to independence and the factors which led to the two-nation theory. Now, that ideological issue is not existing with Bangladesh. When Bangladesh split away, that ideology split away. So you will find a different set of relationships between India and Bangladesh, but you can never have that relationship between India and Pakistan. And I think the faster we realize and come to the conclusion that Pakistan is an enemy state and will remain an enemy state, we should learn to deal with it accordingly. And then I think we can progress ahead. The second is the aspirational path, the aspirational aspect. Now, when I look at the India-China construct, here I look at the aspirational power. India is an aspirational power. We want to be world leaders too. China doesn't want that. China is an aspirational power. They want to be at par with the US and surpass the US. But China, in their own view, have got a very certain philosophy. In one mountain, there cannot be two tigers or two lions, whichever animal you want to call it. So they presume that they are the tigers in the Asian landmass. And they don't want a competitor. And that competitor for them is India. And they will do everything in their power to keep India down. So for any of us who start thinking that, okay, we can have very good relations with China, etc., I don't think it's going to happen. We can have working relations with them, but we must always remember that the India-China construct will be hostile. I've heard people say that, listen, for the last 2 millennia, India and China, we've been very peaceful neighbors, except for 62. But that was because we had the Himalayas separating us. We had Tibet in between as an independent country. So the relationship between China and India was cordial because we never interacted. What was there to fight about when the Himalayas separated you? But that is no longer the case. And today, China seeks domination. And that domination they would try to gain through control of the Himalayas. And that is why you see these conflicts which are taking place, which we call territorial conflicts or border conflicts. But ultimately, it is the Chinese desire to take control of the Himalayas, to take control of the waters of the Himalayas. And if they control the waters of the Himalayas, then they control everything else downstream. And number two, if they can get India to toe the line, then every other country in Asia will automatically fall in line. Just get the big fish. The smaller fish will actually fall in line. So that is the Chinese aim. And I think we must be very wary of the Chinese aim and not fall for any of those love traps which keep coming about, Hindi, Chini, bye-bye, and all that stuff. It is not going to work. We need to be pragmatic. I'm not saying we go to war with China. If we do, we'll win it, but we shouldn't. That is not the point. The point is we must understand the nature of the enemy. China on one side, Pakistan on the other side. And if we understand that nature, we must prepare for it and see that we don't get bogged down. The third, and I think this is a very serious problem for India, though it is not taking part in India, because we are talking about managing future conflicts. And I think this is the Shia-Sunni divide. Now, this is a sectarian divide, and it is not taking place here. It is taking place in West Asia. Now, why that impacts us is because there are various factions vying for the leadership of the Muslim world. We've got Iran at one end, and we've got Saudi Arabia at the other. And now Turkey is also trying to muscle its way in to get leadership of the Muslim world. Now, I have considered this particular aspect perhaps as one which is the most dangerous for India. Because should there be a conflagration in the Gulf, then the direct impact comes to India because all our energy resources come from there. The Americans don't get impacted. They are reasonably independent for energy. The Russians are okay. Ultimately, the people who are going to be hurt, India is an aspirational power, we will be hurt very badly. So I think in our interest, when we are looking at managing future conflicts, when we are looking at conflict resolution strategies, I think we need to pay a great deal of attention to what is happening in the Gulf and to see that no conflict takes place there, or should a conflict take place, at least the energy routes are kept open, or the energy supply lines remain open. The fourth, I call it existential, where a country feels threatened existentially. And here I refer to the dispute which is taking place. I will put it very simply. It is not the dispute between the Palestine and Israel. I will really call it the hostility between Israel and Iran. Now, Iran has consistently threatened Israel with destruction, and Israel takes it very seriously. Now, what happens when a dispute like this is taken very seriously? Iran wants to have nuclear capability. Now, because Iran wants nuclear capability, Israel feels doubly threatened because every leader in Iran has actually stated that they will sort of destroy Israel. And Israel has got no reason to disbelieve that. And the only way Iran can destroy Israel is through nuclear power, a nuclear bomb. So here, I think another fault line is developing, because if Iran continues with its program of making a nuclear weapon, I have absolutely no doubts in my mind that Israel will retaliate and will take it out. And that is going to be a flashpoint. Again, it is occurring in West Asia. So how will that impact us? It will impact us specifically because of the oil, the energy resources. This is another thing which I think we need to look into. And the last point, when I'm looking at future conflicts, because it doesn't matter where they occur, how they're going to impact us, I'm looking at the contest for world leadership, which China is now vying for, and that contest is taking place now in the Indo-Pacific. This is one of the reasons why the Quad has now gained prominence, regardless of what people say about the Quad, whether it doesn't have a military aspect of it or not. But to all the Chinese people whom I have spoken to in their think tanks and otherwise, please take it from me, they are very, very concerned and they are very, very scared. The Quad has the potential, while it is not a military alliance, it has the potential of becoming a military alliance within 24 hours. All the factors to make it into a military alliance are already existing. You are already carrying out exercises by all the four navies together. But leaving that aside, AUKUS has now come in. AUKUS has now come in. And now that is a proper military grouping where Australia will be given nuclear submarines and nuclear-powered submarines. And nuclear-powered submarines are weapons of denial. And that is going to really impinge upon the Chinese on their ability to break out. The second aspect is, what happens if China now attempts to cross the straits and attempts to take Taiwan by force? What do? Will America, the AUKUS and the Quad keep quiet? Possible. We don't know what the future is going to bring. They don't want a war, so they keep quiet. China takes it over. But if China takes over the Quad, takes over Taiwan, then the complete balance of power has changed. China will be the supreme power. Americans will have lost complete credibility. Will Americans allow that? That we'll have to see, whether they allow it or not. So that is another point where a conflagration can occur. A few more points and I'll finish up. You know, a great deal is spoken of human rights. And now the Western powers, they try to pressurize states on the basis of human rights. And I think this is the biggest bogey going around. When millions of Bangladeshis were killed, their women were raped, tortured, it was the West which kept quiet. There were no human rights. Today, when human rights abuses take place in Pakistan, the West keeps quiet. Surprisingly, when the human rights abuses take place in Xinjiang, the complete Muslim world keeps quiet. So human rights, I think, you know, it is the biggest bogey which I have seen, where people use it simply to sort of keep a particular agenda alive. So if you want to browbeat a country, if you want to browbeat India, and some incident takes place where something has happened in one particular state, then the whole world media will get onto human rights, but they will not talk about the human rights where they actually exist. And I think this is something which we need to take note of. The next point, state and non-state actors. Now, I don't believe in the fact that there are non-state actors. All non-state actors will be supported by a state actor. But then here we are coming down to the field of terrorism, cyber, drugs, etc. And this is going to be the new fields of contestation. And how we deal with these threats is something which we have to see. Afghanistan is going to be a test case, because in Afghanistan, organizations like the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State will exist. The Taliban in Afghanistan will not let it go. So if terror emanates from those areas, how will we deal with it? What happens if a cyber attack takes place which is untraceable and it has been done by China? We don't know who's done it, but let us say so. Are we in a position to deal with it? What happens if the Russians do it, or the Americans do it, or the Israelis do it? And cyber attacks can take down cities. It can take down the railways. It can take down the financial systems. I think dealing with these threats is going to be a very major problem. Just a few more small points and then I'll close. I think when we're looking at India per se, we're a bigger nation. And I think bigger nations in South Asia, we need to be very sensitive to how the smaller nations feel, how Nepal feels, how does Sri Lanka feel. And I think the big brother syndrome must give way to what we can call the elder brother syndrome. And if we can get on to change the language from big brother to elder brother, I'm not saying that we are doing it, that we are actually doing the big brother business, but that is what is being perceived at the other end. I think that would be a very important step in getting a large group of the smaller countries in South Asia closer to India. A lot has been spoken about the information environment, perception management, very brilliantly done in the last session. And I think this is one area, in my personal opinion, where India is very, very weak and Pakistan is very, very strong. And unless we get our act together in forms of shaping the information environment, in shaping perceptions, I think we will be losing the perception battle to our opponents. We also spoke of bilateral groupings, and Ambassador Mukerji spoke of SARC. Listen, SARC is dead. There's no point of reviving something which is dead. It is not going to work. I've already stated there is an ideological barrier between Pakistan and India. We can't break that barrier. So let us leave aside SARC, but let us get on to other groupings, other smaller groupings. They could be bilateral, they could be multilateral, but they should be groupings which can work and which can take us forward. And finally, in my view, I think alliances can act as deterrents. And in the future, if India has to join the AUKUS, well, so be it. Or if we can get some other countries to join the Quad and actually put it into a military alliance, I think it would be good. I think climate change will be talked about a little bit later, so I'll stop here and back to the chair.
Well, thank you very much, Dhruv. I'm not going to run short of time. I'll come back to Ambassador Mukerji. Mukerji, this is a typical military way of thinking. I'm sorry to say that. We see threats everywhere. We just see threats everywhere. When I was in the PP and the MO, I walk across to the MEA. We see everybody as enemy. We find no solution to it. We find hell and hell other will land up here. And yet we don't have any answers for it. And the whole idea here is to find answers, find solutions. You just cannot say China can't be trusted, Pakistan can be trusted, this is going to happen, that is going to happen, that is going to happen. So what do you think, seeing the present circumstances, we have what we have. We have to live with it. What is the way forward you feel in terms of going ahead of story arc? I mean, this is a typical way that there are threats all over, everybody, and India is a huge mass who's going to handle it. Where are the resources? Is this all operational, trying to guide our strategy? So I'll leave it to the MEA. And we must have different points of view, because otherwise, if just one point of view narrative is promoted, you land up in a whole lot of things. So I want a counter narrative to come on this, and I'm promoting that counter narrative as to how do we start to look at this horrible alarmist scenario to move forward diplomatically. Over to you, Ambassador Mukerji.
Well, thank you, General Leader, and thank you, General Katoch, for what you said. I think that it is incumbent for anyone who looks at future threats to recognize that there will be threats and that there will be conflict. I think that a utopian world in which there will be no conflict is a fool's game. So therefore, the question is, how do you cope with and how do you respond to threats? I think the first point for a country like India is we need a supportive environment of peace and cooperation to transform ourselves into a major power. That is the national objective. And how do we meet that objective? Can we meet it through confrontation and diversion of our resources for a military response to threats at the cost of our own internal growth? That is something that is a political issue. But in diplomacy, I think you need to keep both in mind. You need to recognize the threat, and you also need to recognize the demands on your own national objectives. And therefore, For example, when we look at the threat from China or the threat from Pakistan, we look at it in terms of a threat from a state. In diplomacy, you deal between states. I mean, that's the way it has been so far. Probably it may change in the next 50 years. Probably we will become, more sort of ideological in this and forget that we are a state and that we are now in an ideology. That I do not know. And that has not been my experience so far. My experience is grounded on the fact that India is a state. We signed a treaty. We became a member of the United Nations. It is a treaty-based organization. It gives us rights and it gives us obligations as state. So I only look at it in terms of between states. And between states, I think there will be interests, but some interests are permanent. That's why I mentioned territory. We have to protect our territory. Everybody wants to protect his own house. I mean, you cannot give a part of your house away and say that it doesn't matter to me, because what is important to me is something else and not my house. I mean, that is not part of human behavior. Therefore, I think that territory is important, and how do we deal with it? Now, in terms of Asia and conflicts in Asia, we have tried to deal with it as states by engaging with each other in dialogue. We set up all these bilateral working groups. Even in the armed forces, you have joint working groups with your counterparts from other states. So, I mean, there is a role and a place for dialogue. And that dialogue needs to give results to achieve a maximum, a kind of balance in which, if you remember the Cold War, the doctrine was mutual assured destruction, or MAD. And therefore, if both sides in the Cold War were assured of mutually destroying each other, they found a way to enter into a dialogue. And that was how the Helsinki process started. And in Asia, I think we have tried to create it, but India has not taken the lead in that. Some other countries have. We have in place a conference for interaction and confidence building in Asia called SICA. Now, SICA was supposed to be the mirror of the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, OSCE. These were the two big regional initiatives. The Asian initiative has not gone anywhere. I do not know why, because we get bogged down with sub-regional, regional, whether to have SARC or not to have SARC, whether to get into SCO or not to get into SCO, and so on, where we have forgotten about the bigger picture. So dialogue is very important in answer to your question. And the second point that I think we need to understand, and this is where alliances become very relevant in the context of what happened in Afghanistan, because an alliance requires you to be an equal partner. And that is the core of an alliance. And for a country like India, which shook off colonial rule because we were not equally responsible for our own future, to enter an alliance and let somebody else decide what that alliance will do is not a viable proposition, politically as well as nationally. As an individual, as an Indian, I would say that I cannot recommend entering into alliances in which our views don't matter. So I think that this is something that is important. How do we make ourselves equal partners? I think the answer has to be a combination of factors. We saw the way Germany and Japan moved in it. Now, Germany and Japan became very big economic powers. So the question was that if you're a big economic power, then you become an equal partner. It did not happen to Germany, nor to Japan. They are not equal partners with the United States, for example. So just your economic profile is not going to give you equal partnership. You have to bring more to the table. And what India brings more to the table is that we have, beyond our economic aspirations, we have a thought leadership. We have something that, most people forget that in the UN Charter, the words human rights were inserted by India. But what has India done since then to lead this whole thing on human rights? Why has human rights today become something that is looked at only from a Western perspective? What happened to the perspective that Dr. Radhakrishnan wrote about for so many years? We've just lost it. So therefore, we have to become equal partners, and only then can we get the benefit of this dialogue. The objective of dialogue is to create a supportive environment which will allow us to realize our own aspirations and transform ourselves. So that's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I do not think there is any time for panel discussion. I don't know who's controlling from the Marshall side, if there is. But otherwise, we will wind up. If there is some panel discussion, Dhruv, who's monitoring that? Anybody there?
General Leader, I think we have 5 minutes more.
Okay.
Unfortunately, because you're on the other side, you're virtual and I'm physically here, but you control it.
Okay.
It's yours.
Okay.
Can I say something? Generator, may I make a statement?
Please do, please do.
Yeah, okay. You see, my comments specifically when I spoke of Pakistan and China, it was not accidental. It was not designed to provoke. It was designed to be realistic. From 1947 till date, we have extended the hand of friendship with China. It has not worked. It was only when more robust policies started being made over the last 5 to 6 years that we found a change in what Pakistan was doing. If you keep getting beaten, if you keep offering the other cheek, the Gandhian philosophies do not work anymore. So you've got to tell the opponent, listen, this much and no further. And I think if this message goes to Pakistan, they will stop sending terrorists into India, which they are still continuing to do. Their drones are still flying across delivering weapons. The terrorists are still coming into via J&K, which means obviously our deterrent hasn't worked. We need to do more. But if we haven't succeeded in friendship for 70 years, let us try a different tack for at least 10 years and make it work. With the Chinese, it is very easy to be friends. You simply have to bow down to them. Are you prepared? I've heard people say, listen, how does it matter? Well, it's up to you. If you want to live as a free country, and as Ambassador Mukerji said, we have to be equals. We cannot have other countries dictating to India what we should or should not do, and certainly not the Chinese. These are the two people who are directly in conflict with us. And China and Pakistan have an axis. Now, let us not deny that. We can keep living in a world to say that, okay, everything will be hunky-dory, but the real world does not work that way. It respects the strong. So the two things which India needs to do, one, and I totally agree with the chair, please get your economy up. The economy has to grow, and internally we have to get our system so that the economy can grow. And number two, side by side, build your military power. But the economy is the prime, because with the economy, everything else works. Chair, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll wind up. We're running short of time. I just want to leave some thoughts with you, because I work with the AU, I work with the EU, I work with the UN, and I see the way they are looking after the conflicts. Today, AU has a voice. When you go to UN, you can keep saying there are African peacekeepers all over today, holding senior appointments, because the AU speaks in one voice. EU speaks in one voice. But what is happening to Asia? This is again a hard reality. The hard reality is, yes, what Dhruv said, Pakistan, China, but the hard reality is today, South Asia is the most distressed, the lowest form of human indices, and cannot even speak in one voice. Wherever we go in a global forum, forget about the Asian cause. We start fighting with each other and blaming each other. I have no solutions for it. Like a Dhruv, I'm a soldier. I have suffered. I have commanded things. I have no answers to terrorism and things like that. They require a military muscle. But it is time that we started looking at options that, okay, within this contour lines, what are the areas? If the alternative one is, yes, these are permanent border problems. These are permanent areas. We have to live with them and we have to do it. We will get economy. We will do it. Everybody has strength. That's one way of looking at it. Other way of looking at it is, okay, you carry out a hard reality check within that umbrella. What is it that is possible? What is possible? What is not possible? Part of it, I presume, will come up in the next session, because that is on conflict prevention. But thank you very much, Dhruv, for your very frank comments and absolutely like a good soldier. And Ambassador Mukerji, we've been working together, and thank you very much for and thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to chair. Thank you very much, everybody.